Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever part of the world you're joining us from. Welcome to the third Oxford University Press History Book Club meeting. My name is Susan Ferber, and I'm one of the history editors at OUP. On behalf of my colleagues, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. For those of you who have joined us for the previous book club meetings featuring Thomas Holt's The Movement or Kevin Weddell's The Complete Victory, welcome back. If you didn't get to see these live, you can watch the recordings on Crowdcast, Facebook, or OUP's YouTube channel. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, here's a little background. Reading and talking about books in a group has a long tradition. In the late 18th and early 19th century, the first secular American reading circles or conversations, a precursor to book clubs, were begun by women in homes, mills, empty classrooms, or wherever they could find a quiet space. They required little more than a thirst for literature and a desire to discuss it with like-minded individuals, talk about challenging ideas, to learn together, and hopefully to have some fun along the way. That's the spirit in which this book club was founded. What we lack in the intimacy of a small group in a living room, I hope we can gain in creating a broad community of readers. This book club will give you the chance to directly interact with authors and ask them questions, as well as the opportunity to continue the conversation online with others in the book club. Every meeting will feature two OUP authors in conversation, in this case, the writer of a new book with one of our classic titles. Over time, we aim to share histories from across the globe, from a variety of periods of history, and from different authorial perspectives. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our book and authors today. This is the most bare-bones description of these historians, since we could easily take an hour just to talk about their accomplishments. Annelise Heinz is an assistant professor of history at the University of Oregon who specializes in gender, race, and ethnicity. She taught in English in Southwest China before going to graduate school. Her first book, which I had the privilege of editing, is the work that we're going to be talking about today, Mahjong, a Chinese game and the making of modern American culture. She is joined by Madeline Shu, professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin. She is the author of numerous books, including Dreaming of Gold, Dreaming of Home, Transnationalism and Migration Between the United States and South China, and more recently a book for OUP, Asian American History, A Very Short Introduction. This is an incredibly concise, valuable, and timely overview that I highly recommend. Annelise and Madeline are going to speak for about 35 minutes, and then the floor will be open to your questions. You can start putting them in the chat anytime, and my colleague Erin Cox will bring up as many as she can in the second part of the program. You can also go to the Twitter feed at OUP History and comment using the hashtag OUP History Book Club. Welcome, Annelise and Madeline. Thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan, for inviting me to participate in this discussion. And thank you, Annelise, for writing this really fascinating book. I guess, unless you have some prefatory remarks, I wanted to just sort of start by asking you about the origin story of Mahjong, and especially your argument that Chinese Americans learned about this game not because they had sort of brought it over as part of their ancestral heritage, but from learned to play the game in the United States. And could you talk a bit about that?
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who is here today. So briefly, the backstory of Mahjong's origins is that it emerged, it evolved, was developed as one of many games in the Yangtze Delta region surrounding Shanghai. That is an area with a long and rich history of game development. And it was becoming more popular in China in the late 19th century. So it really emerged in the mid 19th century or mid 1800s, solidified as what the base is of the game that we know today by the late 1800s, and was one of many mostly male, mostly gambling games that were present in a number of urban areas. But it wasn't something that was necessarily particularly remarkable outside of certain contexts. And one of those contexts was the courtesan culture of Shanghai, which is a really important part of Shanghai society at the end of the 1800s. I mean, courtesan halls, which were places where there were female entertainers that included sexual entertainment, sex work, but also very much hosting, flirtation, and places where men would host their friends, and play Mahjong with each other and sometimes with the courtesans. And these were such an influential part of Shanghai society at the time that some courtesan houses actually printed their own kinds of money, and you could exchange them in certain parts of the Shanghai economy. So when I say it's an important part of courtesan culture, that's significant. But that was really localized, right? Also, at the turn of the 20th century, it became a really important and popular fad in Beijing, particularly associated with the last years of the Qing dynasty under the Empress Dowager's court. She picked it up. She enjoyed playing with it. Certain elements of Beijing society then picked it up and started playing with it. So certainly people were playing it and enjoying it. And it was becoming, again, more popular. But that's not how it came to the United States initially, and it's not how most Americans or Chinese Americans, including other Americans who were living in the United States at the time in the early 1920s, first learned the game themselves. So this is certainly different than the late 20th century when people are continuing to migrate between China and the United States. Now, Mahjong is, quote, the national game of China in China and around the world. There's lots of different regional variations of playing it, right? It's an ongoing story of change and renewal based on where people are growing up in China and coming to the United States from. But that was different in the turn of the 20th century, when it was an era of anti-Chinese immigration exclusion laws. Immigration had slowed in the early 20th century. And most Chinese Americans who were present were from areas around, right? They're mostly Cantonese speakers. They're coming from areas that, although they may have passed through places where Mahjong was becoming more popular, it was not something that they necessarily grew up with. And I was surprised to find this. I really expected that by the time Mahjong emerged as this huge national fad in the 1920s, which is what happens, that Chinese Americans would have already known and played it. But in fact, what the sources showed was that although that was true for some, for many Chinese Americans, they were hearing about it and learning about it alongside this huge international fad. And what I also realized was that a lot of Chinese Americans who had immigrated from China may have actually heard of Mahjong, have been loosely familiar with it, but associated it with this kind of courtesan culture, with a nightlife scene. And many established Chinese American communities in the United States were strongly Christian, had links to missionaries and churches, and really rejected anything associated with gambling. And so what happens in the 1920s, in the early 1920s, when Mahjong gets marketed to a broader American public, and especially the rich and famous and the most, quote, respectable, predominantly white Americans, is that the meaning of the game also transforms and becomes much more distant from its nightlife roots. And so, for example, the pioneering Chinese American sociologist, Party Low, talks about how his stepmother was a strongly Christian woman, but she picked up Mahjong in the 1920s, probably because it was becoming its social meaning had changed, and it was becoming respectable for women to play in their homes, for example.
So one of the things I really appreciated about your book is that you delve into the reasons why and some of the experiences of playing Mahjong that make it like what I thought of was it was like a game that was like a earworm, that it's sort of addicting and it's very pleasurable, but you can just sort of keep playing it on and on and on. And it has, so there can be certain levels of excitement when you actually make a really good hand. It depends on luck, some skill, but it also allows you just to socialize with the other people playing. And there's also just sort of the way that the tiles you can fetishize sort of the material aspects of playing the game. And so and I assume most people, or I don't know if most people here listening in have played the game, but I strongly encourage it. It is just, and I think this is one of the things that makes it so adaptable. And so one of the things that's striking that Annelise talks about is that it becomes this huge phenomenon in the 1920s at a point when, the Chinese exclusion laws are in place, and yet it manages to get recoded. And I was wondering if Annelise wanted to talk more about that, because a lot of people just sort of take it up and just become sort of devotees of it, even though it has a lot of potential negative connotations.
Yes, and thank you for bringing up too that we probably have a range of viewers in the audience today, and so I know that there are hardcore Mahjong fans and players in this talk, and that's fantastic. And I also imagine that there might be some people who are really unfamiliar with the game. So just very, very briefly, this is not going to explain how to play the game, but to establish that sometimes people are more familiar with what's called Mahjong, which is a computer solitaire game that's become really popular over the last decade or so. And I just want to clarify, that's not the kind of Mahjong we're talking about. That game is really just a solitaire matching tiles game, and it uses the same imagery as the tiles. But what we're talking about is the classic game of in-person, especially Mahjong, where there are 4 people predominantly. That's the standard way of playing, 4 people. You play with tiles instead of cards, and there are suits, and you make different combinations of tiles. And today there are over 40 variants of Mahjong around the world. And so each of those variations have slightly different rules, and those rules mean that there are different strategies that players employ. But there are these kind of core commonalities. And one of those experiences is the sensory aspect that you just mentioned, Madeline, of the tiles themselves. The images, the way they sound and look and feel in your hand. And that's certainly something that across variations really connects a lot of Mahjong players.
Also the sound of the washing tiles. I mean, you hear that, it's very loud, but you hear it and you immediately know somebody in their near vicinity is playing Mahjong.
Exactly. It really marks a space. And that's part of how it has, as you've talked about, how it has been adapted, how it's functioned across different social contexts. The meaning and the importance of marking a space as a Mahjong space does have certain ethnic resonances throughout American history in the 20th century. So I realize that's jumping to a different part of our conversation, perhaps, but I wanted to kind of evoke that based on what you said. So you asked about how, if I'm understanding correctly, you're asking about how in the 1920s, when this explicitly Chinese game becomes a huge fad in the United States, how and why was that happening at the same moment as there was a lot of anti-Asian stereotyping and indeed immigration restrictions and legislation? Is that what you're asking?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But it's so associated with so Jewish American culture, Chinese American culture, sort of women's gatherings. It's something that just becomes so a focus for a lot of organizational energy. And I think also a lot of nostalgia and sort of social kinds of, I just have so many memories of my grandmother and my mother, and their social gatherings revolved around just sort of overnight bouts of playing Mahjong with their friends. And it just formed a basis for key community kind of gatherings.
Yes, absolutely. And that too is something that often connects right across different contexts. The game does facilitate a rich kind of interaction, in part because of the rhythm of the game itself and the way that players pause in between rounds of play to shuffle or wash the tiles when you're mixing tiles. It creates just the right amount of time to connect between rounds. That's a little bit longer than shuffling a deck of cards, for example, but not so long that if you're getting to know someone, or if there are language barriers or generational differences, that it puts a lot of pressure on that speech, right? It's a really ideal kind of tempo for building and nurturing relationships that then can grow and change over time. And so yes, I may have misunderstood what you were asking, if just that it's social transformations in the United States. It does. So it emerges in late 19th century, Shanghai Delta area, River Delta, and in the early 20th century, in the early 1920s, a particularly important marketer named Joseph Park Babcock, who was a Standard Oil representative stationed in China, introduced and strongly, heavily, enthusiastically marketed Mahjong to a broader American public. He was never the only person who was bringing over Mahjong sets or talking about Mahjong, but he was a particularly important and influential figure in this story. It becomes this enormous fad that, for those who aren't familiar with this story, just to establish, we're really talking about remarkable levels of pervasiveness of this game or discussion about this game across social registers in American society, so that First Lady and President Harding are playing it in the White House, and Hollywood celebrities are playing it, and housewives are playing it, and working class laborers are playing it. Everybody is talking about, and many of them are playing and buying this game. That fad creates a kind of performative culture around it. Especially white women are dressing up in Chinese costume to play the game. People are holding plays and ballets and writing fictional books about this. And many of those, that culture relies on stereotypical representations of Chinese culture, but specifically oriented towards this idea of an ancient royal Chinese game that we know, right? It's not actually an ancient game, but that becomes a really important part of how the game is understood in the United States. At the same time, Chinese Americans are interacting with this fad, both in their own communities, but also using this opportunity as a rare economic opportunity in a highly discriminatory economy to try to teach people, even if they just learned, right? They're saying, okay, you're buying into this idea of authenticity. I can use this opportunity as well as use it to push against some of the negative stereotypes attached to China and emphasize this positive association. And there are multiple ways that that's happening in American society at the time. It dies out as a fad, but pockets of players continue playing it. And out of those pockets, specifically American variants emerge. One of those comes from Air Force officers' wives, and that variation is known as Wright-Patterson. A Wright-Patterson player added a comment in the chat. Wright-Pat is what it's known as. And another pocket is the National Mahjong League. And out of that pocket comes the National Mahjong League. They're formed in the late 1930s, led by predominantly Jewish American women. And it's their version that becomes the most widespread American variation. And so now today that's called American Mahjong. But again, there are multiple American variations. And that's the game that becomes such an important part of mid-century, so 1940s through 60s, Jewish American women's culture. So that's the kind of overview of how it gets recoded in these different ways.
So it's this American expat notices this great product and decides to take it up and market it as a business opportunity, which actually many people do. So the National Mahjong League founders, the different people who come up with ways to manufacture the tiles. And so what it reminded me of was the consumption of different kinds of international food products. So for example, say, quinoa. Somebody finds quinoa and then identifies it as a great product, or sort of the chili lime flavoring, which was this Thai thing. or like very recently chili crisp, and then people take it up and they sort of they enjoy the consumption of it, but then they also can modify it. And so but it's, I guess you could call it a form of soft cultural interaction or cosmopolitanism. And so, which, but applied here to a recreational leisure time activity. And so I was, as a historian, when you're going to grad school, you're told to, you want to have the project that will make an impact. And you chose to write about a recreational leisure activity. And I was wondering if you could talk more about, doing that kind of history as opposed to, say, writing about a president or wars or something, or like the banking industry, and just sort of what you saw as being, the important things we learned from studying recreation.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm happy to make a plug for cultural history. This is a social cultural history of the game. And as you mentioned, I incorporate this economic aspect and business, but it's really focused on an easily overlooked leisure activity that in fact has been overlooked in the historical record. I mean, most of the archival sources that I accessed and researched and found there was nothing about Mahjong that was labeled in the finding aid or in any of the kind of archival record. I had to use a lot of contextual knowledge to know that, okay, if someone is X, Y, or Z in this time period, there's probably Mahjong somewhere in here, and I could find it that way. But there was that actually, I'm happy to say that for all the researchers out there, your research also in your communication with librarians and archivists helps shape the path behind you of that. Now there's more Mahjong, for example, recorded in some of these archival records because it now gets marked as something that's important or interesting or notable. And so it does highlight, as you're pointing out, how we organize information, but also what we deem as important or revealing. And I think very often we forget about kind of the texture of our own lives, what it is like to experience and make history right now, right? We're all doing that. And so much of how we actually are interacting with major cultural changes, significant economic shifts are in our daily lives, are in the products we are consuming or confronting. It's in the patterns of our time, how we are interacting with others, how we interact with our space, the kind of work we do and where we do it. All of those things, that's when we talk about things like the Industrial Revolution or, modernity. What does that actually, those are abstract terms that certainly we can pinpoint in major economic or political and social and cultural shifts. What does that look like when you are experiencing it? How do you navigate that? How do you actually create or resist certain kinds of changes? And I think how leisure is one way, particularly in American society, because we are so work-oriented, that leisure studies and the history of leisure has been a particularly overlooked realm. And I think that people tend to associate leisure only with people who have, quote, are of the leisured classes, right? But what we see with a story like Mahjong is laundry workers in the early 20th century who are working grueling shifts. They're playing Mahjong, and they're playing it potentially as part of a kind of gambling culture, and compulsion might be a part of that. But it's also about carving out time and space to connect, to mark that space that we were talking about, and to establish a not just relationships, but a sense of a shared experience. And so leisure is also, I talk about the idea of enforced leisure, the problems that people experience when they are in immigration detention at Angel Island, or in incarceration camps in World War II when Japanese Americans, these camps are known as internment camps, but they're actually more accurately called incarceration camps because 2/3 of the people incarcerated in them were American citizens by birth. And so what happens when you are forced to sit and wait and don't have hardly any control over the outcome? That is what I call enforced leisure that actually poses a great psychological burden. So how do you deal with that? What do you what strategies do you employ, and what are the costs and benefits of those? Each of those aspects tells us so much about a broader human experience, a way of understanding time on a kind of micro level, and gets at some of the core questions that shape American social history, like the development of ethnic identities, right? So leisure, I argue, is just as important, for example, in shaping ethnic identities as politics, as labor, as some of these things that we have long recognized as kind of important, and not incidentally, also primarily male or masculine realms of activity. And so I think we need to trouble some of our assumptions that underlie what we consider important or revealing.
One of the things I thought you did really well was to discuss how sort of the materiality of the game, and it was possible. It's for those of you who haven't played the game, but I think for those of you who have, you know that it's possible just sort of to assign sort of a lot of attachment, a lot of connection to the actual physical playing of the game and sort of the pictographs on each tile. And it's just sort of rich with possibility of sort of what is represented and what is symbolized, so that I think there's sort of a kind of intensity in terms of actually playing it and playing it with your regular group. But the group is going to vary, and the meanings are going to vary, and also the point system is going to vary a lot, which is, and so I've been sort of pondering this, and Annelise talks about it at different junctures in the book, just representations of Mahjong playing as a way of showing sort of character development in things like movies and in something like literature. So most recently, sort of probably most visibly, the movie Crazy Rich Asians featured a pivotal scene centered around Mahjong playing, but it shows up in other movies, very importantly in the Joy Luck Club. And so anyways, I wonder if Annelise wants to sort of comment more on these possibilities, that what can be revealed of sort of individual character through how they play the game.
Sure. There has been a great wealth of representation, actually, sometimes very centrally, as you talked about in Joy Luck Club and Crazy Rich Asians, and sometimes more peripherally, as in even Driving Miss Daisy, or Lust Caution Begins, importantly with a Mahjong scene. There are ways that the symbolism and the cultural the specific cultural resonances of the Mahjong game can communicate to viewers who are knowledgeable about those specifics. So, for example, if you know that American Mahjong, or what's called American Mahjong, the National Mahjong League's game, is strongly associated with Jewish American women's culture, glimpsing Miss Daisy playing a round of Mahjong with her friends indicates something about her that is informing you that, okay, she's a Jewish woman. She's this is part of how the movie is establishing that. Mm-hmm. As well as, Jeff Yang wrote a really wonderful piece. Anyone can look it up on Vox.com, Vox.com. Jeff Yang broke down the Crazy Rich Asian scene, and he argues that the part of the importance of that film as a whole, and that is encapsulated in that scene, in which it's communicating a whole range of subtle messages to viewers who are predominantly part of a Chinese global diaspora watching this film, and potentially understanding the nuances of which tiles and what are the symbolisms, as well as a much broader audience who can understand, right, how it moves the plot forward. You don't need to understand those details in order to get the big picture. But that's an added layer of meaning and resonance. And in terms of character development, Lust Caution, which is based on a short story written by Eileen Zhang, has this, you see the power dynamics playing out over a mahjong table. There's a kind of that evokes the hierarchies of this world of the Japanese military occupation of Shanghai in the 1940s, and you get this sense of the danger and the as well as simply the importance of who do you let win? How aggressive is this play going to be? What are the dangers if I don't let someone who's really important win right now? How are we kind of making this war strategy play out on a game set? And so there's lots of different ways that comes up. And I think, in terms of the representations of the 1950s and 60s world of the Catskills, Mahjong was such an important piece of this strongly Jewish American leisure world that was so influential nationally. And so to have Mahjong show up in shows like The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, that becomes part of evoking a certain time and culture of fluorescence of this specific culture that has really mostly gone. The Catskills world is very different today than it was at the time. So there's lots of different ways that communicates a certain kind of historical setting, but could also, again, can communicate with readers or viewers on different registers. And every time you have a big representation like that, it increases the public's interest in this game. People who haven't encountered it before get a lot more interested in it because it is such an evocative feeling.
And so I think there's it takes up some startup energy and resources to buy the set. You have to have the right kind of table. You have to find 3 other people to play with you. But then it just can form a real backbone of a regular kind of social gathering, but also a very pleasurable way of spending time. So my maternal grandmother came to the United States as a war bride in 1947. She came from Guangzhou and Hong Kong, which were sort of very dynamic urban settings, and she ends up in rural Arkansas. And so the Chinese in the South tended to be scattered, and they could only meet occasionally. But so what Annelise describes as the sort of the leisure under confinement, I think certainly applies to my grandmother, because she didn't have many other ways to sort of be able to socialize and just kind of play this game, which is, some of it to me, it kind of replicates what life is like, because you're dealt your hand at the beginning. That involves some luck. But maybe if you're skillful and you sort of have an understanding of how the cards will play out, then you can build a really big hand. So there's the excitement of that possibility. And then if it doesn't work with one round, then you just wash your tiles and then you get another shot at it, right? And then over time, you can sort of accumulate your chips or your money, and you'll see how the evening turns out for you. So it's just, it is a wonderful kind of pastime. And so I also wanted to ask Annelise about the aunt that inspired her to undertake this project. So this aunt must have been very sort of persuasive or just sort of evocative in terms of engaging your interest so deeply.
So the story that Madeline's referencing is that when I was living in China for a year before beginning my graduate work, my wonderful aunt Jane visited my partner and I, and she had grown up with her Jewish friends, mothers playing Mahjong in Denver, Colorado. And she, as a middle-aged woman, knew a lot of other Jewish women who were then also playing in their, years later. And she said, this is clearly a Chinese game. Why do my Jewish friends play it? And so it was really just sparking that question. And the person who really encouraged me to pursue that is actually my partner, who said, there's definitely, it seems like there's this really intriguing connection. And I thought that I could just Google it and find out. And what I discovered is that a lot of people had asked the question. There were theories, but no one had done the scholarly research to find out. And when I just began scratching the surface of the historical record, looking initially for this connection with Jewish American women, I discovered this enormous 1920s explosion of Mahjong and realized, oh yes, there's as historians, we need sources, and there are sources here.
This has been such a great conversation. Hello, everybody in the audience. I'm Erin Cox, who's from Oxford University Press, who Susan said would come in with questions from the audience. I'm here with some questions, but this has been so fascinating. I hate to sort of interrupt with listening to the two of you talk. It has been very entertaining, and I've learned a lot about Mahjong, as I'm sure our audience has too. So I did have one question of my own, because you talked about sort of Mahjong in movies and how it could be telling about characters. Have you seen Mahjong in movies where you're like, this is totally wrong? Like, this isn't accurate. This is, sometimes when I watch movies about publishing, I'm like, this would never happen. Have you ever had any of those experiences or seen any of that in your research?
Well, that's funny that you ask. The strongest example I can think of is actually the opposite, which is, Dirty Dancing, the movie in the early 80s that I loved as a child. I watched it so many times. Still the movie I've seen the most times, simply because I watched it so many times as a kid. And then revisiting that, again, this takes place in the Catskills, in the waning years of the Catskills. I mean, that's part of the plot of the movie, is this transition away from a kind of 1950s Cold War or era culture toward a late 1960s Vietnam War era culture. But Mahjong would have been there. Even though this is, you see the hotel scene where Mahjong was less present than in the bungalow colonies, it is absolutely needed to be a part of the resonance of what they portrayed there. And so it drives me crazy that it wasn't a part of that movie. But it is in A Walk on the Moon, which is also a film that takes place in that same milieu. But Madeline, you had a response. I don't know if you want to share it, but to the crazy.
So it has to do with the Crazy Rich Asians Mahjong scene, and which relies on the Rachel character, who's played by Constance Wu, knowing what card to play so that her prospective mother-in-law would win. And given the kind of hands that the mother-in-law was building, I actually don't think that Rachel would have been able to know what card to throw. That, that even though she's billed as a chaos game theorist, that I don't think she could have known. So that's been my criticism. But I need to go back and rewatch it. But I'm pretty sure that wouldn't have worked.
That's so interesting. Yeah. But it would take somebody who knows how to play the game to understand that, for sure. Right. Yeah. A question from the audience. What was the most rewarding aspect of your research, or most surprising, or both?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to Dara for that question. She's been really a wonderful interlocutor in the Mahjong world. So I think really one of the most rewarding aspects of my research is the way that this connects to people on a personal level. I mean, you can hear that in our conversation right now. Madeline's stories of what this has meant for your family, how it connects to your mom's story of feeling, coming from this incredibly cosmopolitan world to an entirely radically different environment, probably feeling very isolated, but finding connection through Mahjong, how that has continued in in another conversation we had, you talked about other family members, and this just happens over and over again, where I tell people what I'm working on, and the stories just come flooding out, and I love that. Oral histories were a really important part of my research, and it was endlessly fascinating for me. I really love hearing people's connections and stories, and it's not always simple, it's not always positive even, but it's always meaningful. And I hope that one of the things that I can do with my research is, and my book, is to give back to people who have shared so many of those stories with me. And I hope, even if they don't agree with everything I wrote, I hope it provides some context and a way of understanding what it has meant for their own lives or for the lives of their loved ones. So that was certainly the most rewarding.
Yeah,
You
definitely.
could start a website. I mean, you could do a digital project, right? I mean, so Michelle King at University of North Carolina is researching the cookbook author Fu Pei Mei, whose cookbooks were something that Chinese women brought with them to the United States and around the world so that they could know how to cook different Chinese dishes, right? And so it's been a real sort of touchstone in terms of gender and sort of domestic labor. But you could collect oral histories of people around Mahjong, right? And put it up on a website. And I think people might appreciate that.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. I mean, I could easily imagine also like a map that of tracking where people learned, where they've played,
and the system that they use, right? Because it sounds like there's different scoring systems.
Right, exactly.
That's so interesting. One question that I had too was, are you seeing this? So some older games that were played in different generations don't necessarily translate to younger generations. Is Mahjong something that younger people are playing? Is it something that families pass down and sort of start people young playing, or is this something that's sort of maybe not going to die out, but it's going to be in smaller subsets maybe?
Yeah, and this is definitely something that is a little bit different across different culture and social contexts. Big picture, it does, the patterns around Mahjong are definitely shaped by things like work and child rearing and larger kind of economic forces. And so there's definitely things that as we have as a society moved toward, away from the hard-won gains of leisure from the labor movement, we've moved more and more towards this kind of erosion between work and home. And I'm certainly part of that. I'm guilty of that too. And so what we see is, I think, fewer people in their years of young parenthood or early career or even mid to late career having less time or choosing to prioritize something like this less. And however, there is a Mahjong renaissance right now, and much of that is being led by retirees who, again, we talked about how Mahjong is such a powerful way to make connections, to form community. And people are moving to new communities, learning different styles from people who are coming from different places, and crossing some of the boundaries that had, particularly ethnic and gender boundaries that had shaped kind of styles of play. There's more mixing it up now. And at the same time, young people are also a part of that. So although I don't think that they're participating in as high numbers, particularly coming at it from a point of ethnic connection, there is, young adults who learn about the Jewish American culture in the 1950s sometimes even young men, right? Even though historically this has been a strongly women's game, are interested in learning about it because of this identity. Also, a lot of Asian American young adults, particularly in a context in which we're living in right now, where there is not only ongoing issues of cultural appropriation and erasure, but also direct assaults and a feeling of highlighting that sense of how do I connect with and protect my community in the face of enormous hostility. And Mahjong is one piece of that. Again, even if they grew up with it but didn't know it, there's a thing I've heard from people saying, I need to learn this. I should know this, right? This is part of who I am. And so I think I'm hearing that in different ways also from young people.
That's great.
It seems to me to constitute a great backbone for sort of a regular socializing activity, right? So people have, say, a monthly book group, but it takes, once you get the set and the table, it takes less effort than actually, having to read that book. But I mean, you gather, you're with people that, that you see regularly. And it's, and it's a really just fun activity, right? And so, and I guess there are ways in which it might be comparable to some of those computer games, right? But you can connect with your friends remotely, right? And you actually participate in the same game online. And I guess you can chat with each other back and forth. There's different kinds of functions, but there are aspects of that in Mahjong, although it's not sort of the same kind of you're not shooting weapons and like having like alien enemies, but but I think it allows for similar kinds of social dynamics.
Yeah. You talked about, sort of the Mahjong that we're speaking about, but also the sort of maybe solitaire on the computer. Do you think there will be something that's in between there that is sort of like the game that you're speaking about, Madeline? Do you think somebody can create something that will sort of have that same kind of cultural exchange or community spirit, but for a digital environment?
Go ahead, Madeline.
So my experience, I learned to play when I was like 8 or 9 years old. And this is because the adults in my grandparents' sort of Chinese community in Arkansas, they would try to play about once a week. And, at times they need somebody to fill in. And so, and you can be brought in at a relatively low level of skill and be a placeholder. But I think there was the game itself as a pastime, but also very, very important were actually the human relationships, right? And so I think the sort of the solitaire version of Mahjong that you get on the computers doesn't provide that, right? It provides a way to pass the time, but I think just sort of what Annelise has talked about for women and for just sort of Jewish Americans in the Catskills, and also for many Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans, it was just also a way of, very importantly, of connecting. And so, and I don't see the computer versions providing that.
I'll just add that the pandemic has been a really key time to kind of experiment with that. And so, yes, certainly not in terms of the solitaire version, which is really a fundamental game, but this question of how do groups who Madeline just talked about, this really core backbone of people who have gathered together every week for 40, 50 years, right? What do we do now? And so that has played out a lot in some of the larger groups, like on Facebook, that are of players talking about what are you doing. And in this context, a number of different online versions cropped up, where people could, and sometimes they did it where they'd be playing, but they would meet certain players at the group, and then they would also have a video chat going, or they have text threads going, and then eventually integrated video chat in the game. The technology integrated it, so they were able to approximate that. And so it's definitely been really an active process. And I think that before the pandemic, I interviewed someone who said, I play with in this online version where I don't know the people, but it is real people I'm playing with. But the focus is like a competitive game, right? A fast-paced game. And I have my weekly group of people who I love, who are also very skilled players, but there is a much more social aspect to it. It's less intense. And for me, I want to do both. And I suspect there will be more kind of mixing and matching now as we hopefully exit this time where we haven't been able to gather. And people now being more familiar and comfortable with digital options and what they can get from that and how that's may continue to supplement an in-person game. But I have heard from virtually no one who has a group that they love to meet with in person who's like, oh no, I'm just going to sub it out. I mean, that's really, as Madeline said, right, this is part of the joy of it is getting together in person as well.
Right.
So the digital version, do they have the sound of the tiles washing?
That is a great question. And if somebody has I haven't played the digital version. So if somebody knows the answer.
It seems essential to me, to the experience, to have that.
I totally agree. I mean, and I do though I did talk to someone who actually, they would have their tiles out themselves again, and this kind of own analog approximation that they would actually hold the tiles so that they could have the experience.
Oh, wow.
They would be, in American Mahjong, you rack your tiles. So they would be racking their tiles along with the digital version to have that experience because the sensory piece is so valuable. So.
Wow, that's so interesting. I really love that. A question from the audience. Do you have a favorite tile and why?
Madeline, I would love to know your answer to this too. I've thought about this. I've been asked that.
It feels like a very personal question. Is it a very personal question?
Well, you know, the one of bamboo is actually like a bird. It's a very fancy bird. It's a phoenix. So I've always liked the one of the bamboo, or the one of the circles, which is sort of a more elaborate design.
Yeah, the cover of the.
And then also, yeah. And then also, but like with, so Annelise actually describes this because the designs are etched into the tiles, and then you can actually use your thumb to feel. And so those are some of the ones, especially the one of circles, you can actually use your thumb to feel what it is. Yeah. And it's also a bit of, it's like having your lucky rabbit's foot. So if you're waiting for a particular tile, this is what the skilled players would do, is they'll rub the surface before they look at it to see, if it's the tile they need to win. Yeah, it's very tactile.
I think for me, related to what Madeline was referring to as well, my favorite tiles are the ones where you can have such beautiful expression and variation within a standardized design. So the bamboo is one of the suits. The one is, rather than a single rod of bamboo, it is a bird. And there's actually, especially in the early years in the 20s and 30s with these hand carved sets, you get such exquisite levels of details. There's one that's an owl. There are certainly a phoenix, peacock, right? There's a whole range of different kinds of birds, and then in a more kind of rudimentary set that wasn't as skillfully carved, or later machine pressed sets, you still have that kind of variation and interest. And also in the one dot or one circle, within those, there could be lots of even words and messages carved into the tiles. And so again, that kind of level of individuation within a standardized set is, I think, one of the things that makes the material aspect of this so rich, that also directly relates to the social aspects and the history of the manufacturing. So it really connects to all of those pieces.
That's so interesting. We're about to run out of time, but I wanted to give each of you an opportunity to sort of say one last thing that you want the audience to take away from the conversation or from your work or research.
I'll go first, and then Annelise. But no, I think this book is really just a wonderful exploration that operates at the intersection of gender and race, but also just a set of possibilities around sort of recreation and this leisure activity. And one of the things that I've been reflecting on is that, you know, we have a game, it's just sort of a wonderful game in terms of sort of the luck and the skill involved, but also the sort of the material aspects of the tiles and sort of the sounds associated with it, but that it was claimed by so many different groups, right? It becomes just sort of like an intrinsic aspect of many different cultures, which, you know, it seemed to me to suggest a possibility, especially at a time when we seem so conflicted between the United States and China, that there's actually aspects of culture and experience that, you know, that we can share and we can absorb. And so I've been reflecting on these kinds of possibilities. Anyways, but so it's a very pleasurable read and just so evocative, especially because Mahjong playing has been such a, you know, such an ongoing and meaningful part of like my family history.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those kind words, and thank you for your feedback and for your thoughts. I think for my kind of final thoughts, I hope that people take the opportunity to think about how in our own lives we experience and shape cultural change. And relatedly, one of the things that I encountered so often, especially because I particularly interviewed older women, was the number of people who would say, "Why are you interviewing me? I'm not important. My life wasn't important. I was a housewife, or I didn't do anything special. Mahjong is just kind of a silly thing." And I really want to, if you have people feel empowered to think of themselves as agents of history, and housewives make culture, and working class laborers who work extremely long hours make culture, and people who we don't often think of as important historical actors are. We are all making history, and we all get to make choices around that. And so I hope that this is something that people also can take for themselves as well.
That's really moving. Now I have to say, so I have to do like housekeeping stuff now, and I'm like almost crying. but I think it's important, and I think that's so, particularly women of the generation that you were interviewing, and maybe, you know, people who have immigrated here who, you know, don't feel like they're part of the mix, or, you know, that's a really important statement. Thank you for saying that, and thank you both of you for a really fascinating conversation, really interesting. I highly recommend everybody going and picking up both of your books. There's a little link I put in the chat for you can go to our History Book Club website where you can see more about their books and past book club meetings that we've had. And I'll just do one little shout out to our next book club meeting, which is July 1st at a different time than usual. We'll be doing it at 5 p.m. Eastern time, and we'll be featuring Phoebe S.K. Young and Andrew Kirk discussing Young's book, Camping Grounds, Public Nature in American Life from the Civil War to the Occupy Movement. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Madeline. Thank you, Annelise. This was really, really wonderful, and we appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
It's been a pleasure.
Bye.